Are you looking forward to the brand new Nikon Z30 coming out this week? Nikon's new APS-C mirrorless camera due to succeed the Z50, but cost less. Release date and details coming up. But first, I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you're kept informed on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. The Nikon Z30 is the new Nikon APS-C camera being announced this week, according to Nikon Rumors, saying, even though I do emphasize the word rumored, I'm pretty confident in this information. Along with that confidence, Nikon Rumors says that the announcement date is June the 19th, although they did put a caveat in there saying it could happen plus or minus 1 day. Okay, we're only 2 days away from this announcement, and we don't even have an exact date and time, although the source is relatively reliable, and this is really frustrating. If the source is reliable, why can't we get a little bit more information? Why can't we know the exact date and time? And when it comes to specifications, well, those are a little lacking too. We don't even have a full set of leaked specifications, let alone a partial list. All we have is, well, we have a few tidbits. One is price. It's supposed to cost $999, or right around that $999 price point, which is pretty much in keeping with Canon's recently announced Canon EOS R10 at $979. And those dollar signs, while it looks comparable and compatible next to the Canon EOS R10, it's some 20% cheaper than the Nikon Z50, released back in 2019 for a price of $1196. And last year, Nikon released the ZFC for $1096. So between 10 to 20% cheaper than previous Nikon APS-C censored cameras in a market where everything, and I mean absolutely everything, is going up in price. We're looking at 8% inflation in the United States alone, and much of the world due to component prices, resource shortages, retirements, and the list goes on. So 20% cheaper than a camera that was released prior to everything going completely haywire. Well, that is impressive, and I'm not sure what to think about that. We'll just have to wait and see if this rumored information actually pans out. And in terms of what specifications we do have, well, this new camera, the Z30, which is supposed to be a successor to the Z50, which makes sense because otherwise we'd have 3 cameras within $200 of each other. But the Z30 is supposed to have the exact same sensor and image processor as the Z50 and the ZFC. So that's the 20.9 megapixel sensor and the X-Speed 6 image processor. And the rumor goes on to say that, well, much of the internal components of the ZFC and the Z50 are going to be in this camera. I gotta admit, I would be a little bit disappointed if this was to be the case, if we were basically just getting the same components with some of the specs warmed up, dialed up a little bit more. But I want to caution you a little bit on reading too much into this. First of all, this is a rumor, and if we're supposed to get the announcement in 2 days, well, we don't have long to wait and see. When Canon was getting ready to announce the R10 and the R7 last month, a lot of people were saying, I don't get this. What, it's supposed to have the exact same sensor as the M6 Mark II or the Canon 90D, that 32.5 megapixel sensor? And I said, well, hold off a little minute, guys. Hold off a minute. Just because it has the same resolution doesn't mean that it's going to be the exact same sensor, and it isn't. The R10, the R7 get a new sensor. They get a new image processor. They are different cameras. And that's what I'm kind of expecting to have. Well, that's what I'm expecting for the Z30 to be able to do too, is have more or less similar specifications, but to be better in many different ways. And I think the Canon EOS R10 helps set the bar in this regard. These are the specifications for the Canon EOS R10 released just last month. And I want to use these specifications to help frame the Z30 rather than the Z50 and the ZFC. And here's the reason why. It was just released. And Nikon knows about this camera. I can't imagine them releasing the Z30 if it was significantly underperforming this camera at around the same price point. The Canon R10 is $979 for the body alone. So looking at the specifications, the first thing I want to talk to you about is the sensor. 24.2 megapixels compared to 20.9, so about 3.3 megapixels more. Some of you might be thinking, oh, 20 megapixels, 21 megapixels, this is nothing today here in 2022. And I really disagree. While personally I think that 24 to 26 megapixels is the sweet spot, is still a terrific camera. I still shoot stills with it, even though it's some 8-9 years old. And when I'm in post, I never once think, wow, these files are just too small. There's not enough information here. More often than not, they're absolutely perfect. The opposite is true when I shoot with a Canon R5 with its 45 megapixel sensor, the same sensor size as the Nikon Z9. I'm often thinking, these are too big. These are huge. The files are absolutely huge, 50 megapixels per image. They're just absolutely staggering, the size of these images. And for this marketplace where this camera's aimed, I think that 20 megapixels, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, there are some limitations of having a smaller sensor size. You can't crop in as much. And of course, when it comes to video, well, it limits your opportunity to shoot oversampled video. So with a 20.9 megapixel sensor, you're kind of limited to around 5.1, 5.0 oversampled 4K. But there's no mention of whether this camera is going to have oversampled 4K, but I'd be really surprised if it doesn't. The Canon R10 has 6K oversampled 4K, and according to DP Review, Gordon Lang, and many, many others looking at this camera, it's the most detailed video resolution on that camera. The 4K is absolutely stunning for that price point. It's much better than the Canon 90D. It's much better than the M6 Mark II or any other APS-C camera that Canon has released. That oversampled video mode makes a huge difference, but also it's able to do 4K up to 60 frames per second. Now, 4K 60 isn't nearly as detailed as 4K 30. 24, 25, and 30 frames per second is where you get the detail, but once you go to 4K 60, you get more cropping, you get less detail. It's not as good. So I really think that if I own the R10, I'd be living in that 4K 24, 25, and 30 oversampled. I think that will be where we just get an incredible amount of detail. It doesn't shoot log, it's just 8-bit, but still a much greater improvement over previous Canon cameras. So that leads me to the image processor, the XPEED 6. Does the XPEED 6, coupled with a sensor, allow this camera to be able to do 4K 60, full sensor readout? I will just have to wait and see. I mean, that's assuming that we are getting the XPEED 6, but really we're talking about an awful lot of data here in transit, and then of course being able to store that data, and that is a pretty impressive feat. And to be able to do that for around $1,000, if this camera can do 5 or 5.1K oversample 4K, so what if it's a little bit less detailed than the Canon EOS R10? I think this is going to be seen as a win. The other thing I want to talk to you about, again, looking at these specifications of the Canon EOS R10, stills continuous shooting frame rate. The R10 has a staggering 15 frames per second mechanical or 23 frames per second electronic. Now, there's a huge caveat here. Basically, if you hold down that shutter button, you're going to get about a second, and that's it. So maybe 23, 30 frames tops before the buffer fills up, and then it's going to take a little while for that buffer to clear. When you're shooting burst mode, quite often, at least what I do, is I'll hold down that shutter button for a fraction of a second. I rarely hold it down for a second or more because, well, at even just 20 frames per second, you'd be amazed. You can easily come away with thousands and thousands of images over a half an hour period when you're shooting with a macro lens or anything else where you're holding down that shutter button. It's just absolutely ridiculous. The ZFC and the Z50 both shot at 11 frames per second. And being that both of these have the same frame rate makes me wonder if they do have the exact same sensor and the exact same image processor, are they going to be capped, or is Nikon going to be able to push these up to about 15 frames per second? And I think that's the key here. I really do expect that it should be able to shoot faster than 11 frames per second, although I still think 11 frames per second is pretty good. And let's do another reality check here. If you're going to be doing sports, you're going to be doing water skiing, you got your kids up on water skis, learning to water ski for the first time, what really matters more than anything else is the accuracy of the autofocus. Because when you're water skiing, everything's moving. You're moving because you're on the boat. They're moving because they're skiing, and being able to have the autofocus nail things, well, I'd say at least 80 to 90% of the time is very, very important. And I think that when it comes to shooting sports or anything fast action, the bare minimum is 7 frames per second at 100%. So once you start to move above that, you know, if this is going to do just 11 frames per second, that is a little bit of a disappointment, but still it's completely usable for most hobbyists. And even today, I find that I rarely ever use 20 frames per second on the Canon EOS R5. Most of the times I'm shooting mechanical, and most of the times based on the settings, I'm only at around 7 or 8 frames per second. I've timed this with the settings, with how I've got the camera set up. I'm quite often shooting at 7 or 8 frames per second, and that is usually more than fast enough for me. However, when I do need to kick it up in speed, if I'm doing macro photography, quite often I click over to electronic, And that's where I have to be very, very careful because, wow, 20 frames per second, it adds up pretty quickly. So as far as the video specs go and the still specs go with the Canon EOS R10, I think that looks to be a pretty good camera for its price point, $979. Sure, it doesn't do log, and I don't expect the Nikon Z30 to do log either. But I think if the Nikon Z30 can come pretty close to these specifications, I think it's going to be a success. I don't believe that the Z30 has to beat all the specifications of the Canon EOS R10 here in order to deliver a camera to compete. I think if you own the ZFC or the Z50, all the camera has to do is come close to these specifications to offer faster frame rates, to offer better video resolution. And I do think for video, though, it has to offer an oversample 4K mode. It doesn't have to be 6K oversampled. It doesn't have to be 8K oversampled. If it just does 5 or 5.1K oversample 4K, it's going to deliver that much improved detail, especially if it's doing full sensor readout. Another camera, the Canon EOS R6, does 5.1K oversample 4K, and the detail in 4K is much improved over the standard 4K mode. So I do really believe that oversample 4K is essential to this camera, not because that's what the market is clamoring for, but because that's what the competition is offering. And to get people to upgrade from the ZFC or the Z50, which is what I think Nikon has really got planned here, it does have to offer more than just a couple of minor updates. Keep in mind, the Z50 came out back in 2019. That's a long time ago. We're already getting ready for 2023. 2023 isn't that far away. We've already spent through half of this year, and now we're in the summer. Schools are about ready to let out this week. So July and August are going to go by pretty quickly, and before you know it, we're going to be in September and October for the latest camera and lens releases for this year before we start warming up for 2023, which is going to be a very, very big year. We're going to have the Canon EOS R1 flagship camera, the last flagship camera of the big three, Nikon and Sony, and we're going to start to see some other refreshes. Where is Panasonic with their S-Series Mark IIs? The S1, the S1R, and the S1H. We could see some announcement this year, but I think we're really getting primed for next year for some releases and updates of these cameras. So that's going to be a really exciting time. So yeah, 2022, June the 29th, or maybe the 28th, or maybe even the 30th. I can't see them pushing it much longer because we're getting up to the holiday weekend here in North America. Starting first on July the 1st is Dominion Day or Canada Day. It's a national holiday here where Canada separates, well, not being independent from Britain, but it's its own national holiday of when the country came together, confederated, all the different territories, Hudson's Bay land previously, the British North America Act, it all came together and formed Canada. And of course, on July the 4th, our friends to the south of us celebrate Independence Day. And they were already a country at that point, and it was to celebrate becoming a country, to being independent from the motherland, Britain at the time. So very different histories, but very similar histories as well. If you look into Canada and the United States, some people in Europe will refer to Canada as the US Light, but you'll notice that in many, many areas we're very, very similar, but in other areas we're very, very different. So we got those two holidays coming up, so I really can't see it getting pushed much further than that. And then any other announcements aren't going to happen towards the end of this week and into next week, and then we'll start to see more announcements probably from the middle of July onwards. So I'm really excited. I'm really excited about the different announcements that are due to come up. But back to the Nikon Z30, what I want to really caution you on here is this rumor. It really is lacking an awful lot of substance. And I want to go back to that quote. Even though I do emphasize the word rumored, I'm pretty confident in this information. Now, if I was really confident about something, I wouldn't say I was pretty confident. Those are kind of wiggle room words. I would say that, yeah, you know what? This is coming from a known source, a reliable source. We are definitely getting the Nikon Z30. We're going to be getting it this week. We don't have a date and time yet. I wasn't able to get that information, but it's definitely coming this week, and it's definitely going to have at least these specifications. Instead, we know that it's supposed to be coming this week, but other than having the same sensor and processor as the ZFC and the Z30, which I kind of doubt a little bit, I wouldn't be surprised if they're updated to some degree. But outside of that, we don't have anything here to get excited about. And just releasing or leaking this information itself, the same image processor and sensor, usually what that does to people, if a camera came out 3 years ago and the new camera has the same basically internal components, that usually gets a big yawn from everybody. And anybody who's got that older camera basically says, yeah, I'm not upgrading. There's not enough new here to get me to sell my old one, take a loss, and buy a new camera. That probably will be in short supply. No, it's basically anybody that had an older camera that's looking to move to the mirrorless system that might say, yeah, okay, you know what? This camera is enough of an improvement that I'm going to go ahead and buy the Nikon Z30. So we just have 2 days potentially, well, 2 to 4 days to get the announcement of this camera. So I'd really wait and see. I'm kind of thinking 2 to 3 days, because at 4 days, again, we start to get into some national holidays and people start taking off early. So I would expect 2 to 3 days we'll get the announcement of the Nikon Z30. So let's hold off our groaning. And yes, you can put some of your groans. If you want to vent and release, use the comment section down below. I'll be there shortly to provide you with my replies. Or maybe give us your wish list. So we've got the Canon EOS R10 specifications because they've already been announced. Tell us based on that camera what you'd like to see the Nikon Z30 do. Do you currently own a Nikon camera? What are you looking at Nikon doing here to be able to get you to change from the old DSLR system over to the new Nikon Z system? Let me know in the comment section down below. But if you want to stay up to date on the latest news and information, the latest camera news and information, like the Nikon Z30 and any updates we get over the next couple of days, go ahead and subscribe. But please, please make sure you choose all notifications, because by choosing all notifications, that's what allows you to get notified as soon as I publish a new video, so you can stay up to date on the latest camera news and information, or news and rumors. That's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourself a great day, rest of the summer. And if you're here in North America, have yourself a great Canada Day and a great Independence Day. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you again soon.